Hey guys, and welcome back to the Past Priority Podcast, a podcast where we talk about competitive Commander from a different perspective. We are your hosts today, Evan and Zach. Let's talk a little bit about where we've been, I guess.
Yeah,
Uh,
it's been a minute, hasn't it?
yeah, a lot of us are finishing the semester in school. I know I just had finals the past couple weeks, and Greg's been backed up with his own finals and things going on. So editing and video production's been a little slow, but we're gonna try to pick up the pace again here, starting
Yeah,
January.
definitely between holidays, end of semesters for most of us. I
hmm
think just Dante and I are the ones that don't have school or like that kind of
Ooh,
obligation. Yeah, I know, but having your main video editor locked up in finals definitely slows down the production. But
yeah,
we're hoping that through the holidays and into next year or next semester for you two, can get a little bit more consistent recording here.
yeah, definitely. Just a process that everyone has to understand.
Yeah,
Definitely.
remember, stay in school, kids.
Yeah,
It's very
please stay in
important.
school. You can afford more magic cards if you stay in school. That's the
True.
whole reason I'm doing
Definitely
it.
true.
So today we're going to talk about tempo in Magic and what it means to, what tempo means in Magic. And I'm just going to let you start it off right away since you have played more 1v1 formats, or you come from 1v1 formats and moved to Commander.
Yeah, definitely. Tempo is everyone's favorite keyword to throw around and describe and not. I feel like a lot of people have like a general concept of what like feels like tempo, like when they see it, they can recognize it, but they have a difficult time actually defining it in words and explaining it to people outside of just given examples. I've watched several videos, I've seen several podcasts. People trying to describe this topic. I've seen some very good attempts. Notably, I think Rebel does a great video on defining tempo and gives some great examples. I believe Drake Sasser also is in that video, gives an excellent definition. Also, listening to the Leaving a Legacy podcast with notable CEDH personalities of like Brian Cook, Brian Koval, also do a very good job of defining tempo in the context of legacy.
Like I do
Um,
want to point out that all these other players that you're talking about all come from 1v1 formats where tempo is a lot more of a thing than it is in Commander. And I think that's just important to know because I actually didn't know the difference until you told me about it earlier.
oh yeah, so let's start all the way at the most basic definition of tempo and slowly get our way into Magic and then into CEDH as a format and how tempo applies there. So starting first, the very word tempo relates to like time or turns. In this case of like games, it's like the pace at which you play. So I think the easiest way for me to explain tempo is in another one of my favorite games, chess. Chess is very simple to explain to somebody.
hmm
Stay with me here. Don't let your eyes gloss over. I will. We're going to take a brief dip here, and then we're going to come right back to Magic. Don't you worry. So in chess, very simple game. You get one move a turn. Your turn is a tempi. You have one movement. If you can spend your turn forcing a movement out of your opponent that they would otherwise not make, you've gained tempo. You've gained time on them because you have forced them to waste their move doing something. Hopefully, Greg can insert an image here of like some chessboard that I'm going to send him later. But an example of this in chess is like when you put somebody in check. So if I move a rook to put a king into check to force him to make a move, I can then put the king in check again, force them to make another move, and then I might be able to capture a piece from that position. So by making forcing plays, wasting your opponent's time, I am gaining tempo and I am furthering my lead in a game. So
It definitely
we're
makes
done with
sense.
chess. How does this tie back to Magic? Magic has a similar structure, turns. What defines your turn? What's the very first thing you do on a turn? Evan, what's the very first thing you do on a turn?
I like to untap all of my permanents.
Yeah, you untap your lands. Your lands and your mana and your untap step are a huge definition of your turn. You get one untap step a turn. You get to play one land a turn normally. So the general tempo of Magic is you get a land drop per turn, you increase your total mana that you have access to every turn by making a land drop, and you get to untap all of that mana every turn. So your use of mana defines your tempo. Um,
Mhm.
so in 1v1 Magic, it's very back and forth, similar to chess. You have your untap, your opponent's untap, back and forth. You're both developing mana. You're both using that mana to cast spells. The person who is more able to effectively use their mana and gain tempo over their opponent is more likely to win the game. So the best example that most people think of when defining tempo decks or that tempo style of play is Blue Red Delver in Legacy. This has been a deck that probably, yeah, it even predates the namesake card Delver itself, dating all the way back to like the very beginnings of Legacy. The Delver archetype is defined by its tempo playstyle. So when I think of tempo and gaining tempo on some interaction, I think of how much mana I'm putting in versus the effective mana I'm getting out, whether it's like the effect that I'm getting or the mana that my opponent puts in contrast to what I put in. So the biggest example here, Force of Will. Force of Will costs 5 mana, technically.
Never.
You not very often are you spending 5 mana on that spell. It's usually being cast for its alternate cost. I am spending 0 mana to counter a spell. Ideally, your opponent's spell costs more than 0 mana when you're using a Force of Will on it. So if I Force of Will my opponent's 3 drop, I've spent 2 cards to get their 1 card. I am losing card advantage, but what I lose in card advantage, I'm gaining in tempo. I've spent 0 mana of my resources on 3 mana of my opponent. My opponent has tapped out for their turn. They've spent 3 mana. They don't get that mana back once I've countered their spell. I am
Mhm.
ahead in tempo on this interaction. Even worse, I daze your 3 drop after you tapped out for it. Daze is such a back-breaking tempo play in Legacy where like 3 drops are considered like high-end haymakers in the format. Um,
Yeah, I'm not a professional Legacy player by any means, but, my friends and I, we kinda put together or proxied up the best, quote unquote, best legacy decks. And Delver definitely has this advantage over pretty much all of them by just being able to put out the cheap threats, but then use the rest of its hand just to stop the other person for no mana. And it's
mhm.
ridiculous.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, the namesake of the card, Delver of Secrets, the reason why it is such an important part of the deck is because of what the way that you usually gain tempo in these sorts of play styles. Like, as I said, when you play Days for its alternate cost, you're picking up a land that has a different cost associated with it that isn't directly mana. Force of Will, trading 2 cards for 1 card of your opponent's, has a cost. It's card advantage. You are sacrificing card advantage for the tempo of the game. You can't trade 2 cards for 1 card for your opponent ad nauseum. You won't be able to keep up with that. They draw more cards. If you're spending more cards against their cards, eventually their card advantage will surpass what you were able to do, and the pendulum of like who is effectively in the lead will swing back into the favor of card advantage. What Delver of Secrets provides for that deck is a time box. It says, if I play this on turn 1, flip it on turn 2, you have 7 turns. I just have to out tempo you for 7 turns and the game will be done. And it doesn't matter. You could have drawn 30 extra cards. If I have tempoed you out of the game for those 7 turns, I've won. So
Right.
there's this sliding scale of how effective tempo is early to the point when card advantage and your normal tempo and pace of play will eventually catch up in a game.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
Cool. So, one last example that I want to bring up here in the context of more 1v1 magic and more 1v1 cards,
Mm, right.
Thoughtseize.
Thoughtseize.
A lot of people love Thoughtseize. It's probably one of the most iconic spells in magic. Thoughtseize is tempo negative. The decks that play it are usually like control decks, Jund, or like combo decks that might be trying to like protect themselves and remove very specific things. But the easiest way to explain Thoughtseize here is I am spending 1 mana and 1 card to remove 1 card from you, but you haven't spent any mana on that card. It is a tempo negative play. That is usually why you don't see cards like Thoughtseize and Delver or discard spells outside of like a sideboard where you're trying to like attack a very specific combo deck, where that one card does matter because it buys you that time because the deck is centered around it. Thoughtseize is just in general a tempo negative play. You want to be trading up on mana, down on cards.
Yeah, so it is really important to look at the 1v1 format when we talk about the origins of tempo and what it means in Magic. But uh, this is a commander podcast, so I think I'll be able to weigh in more on
Yes.
this next part about the difference between tempo in 1v1 versus the tempo in commander because it's very much not the same thing. You
No, not at all. So let's go back to our favorite card, Force of Will. Force of Will
mhm,
is a ubiquitous card in our format, but it's not because it's a tempo positive card like it is in something like a Legacy Delver Shell. Let's say I am in seat one, seat two casts an ad nauseum. Priority goes all the way back around the table through players 3 and 4. It hits me. I am left being the lone control player and saying, I have to Force of Will this. I have to save this game for the rest of us. I cast Force of Will. I go down 2 cards. Yes, I have traded 0 mana on my part for 5 mana of my opponent. The other 2 players at the table, they didn't spend mana on this interaction.
they didn't
They're
spend
up
anything
three
on the
cards
interaction.
comparatively to the rest of the table and the 5 mana that that one opponent spent. So, in order to be tempo positive, you have to think a little bit differently here. This is where I jump in and say stacks pieces are a tempo positive play. And a lot of people will roll their eyes, and we go back to one of our original episodes and say how like stacks is just a control deck. No, stacks is tempo. If I cast a sphere of resistance on turn one, what is everyone else's turn one going to look like?
A lot worse.
Land pass.
Yeah,
They make a mana. Maybe if they're lucky, they cast their mana crypt for 1 mana. Like they are effectively wasting that turn's mana. They're not getting mana out of it. So my 2 mana play of casting that sphere of resistance has netted a mana from each opponent. That's 3. My 2 mana has netted 3 mana out of my opponent's right there. That's a tempo positive play in my definition of it.
right. So stacks definitely is the way to tempo more opponents all at once. But when you're looking at counter magic as a piece of tempo, what are from your own experience or even my experiences, what are we looking to counter when I have that force of will or I have that mind break trap or whatever it may be? Like what am I trying to hit with this? Because I know for a fact I'm not trying to use it. Uh,
Yeah, it's these types of effects that are like tempo positive on only an individual opponent. Really, you want to be saving as like a last resort. Like they are countering ad nauseum, they're countering Thassa's Oracle, they're countering Underworld Breach, or maybe it's not like on the surface a game winning spell, but things like Rhystic Study, Mystic Remora, Seedborn Muse, they are effectively ending the game. You don't know it, but you've probably lost when that Seedborn Muse resolves and they've gone around and there's been 7 Thrasios activations. That game's done. Like, pack it up. That game is over. There's no reason to play it out more.
right.
You had to counter that you had to counter that Seedborn Muse.
Yeah, counter it, destroy it, all these other things, but the
Mm-hmm.
reality is you had to take that loss of resources on your parts just
Mm-hmm.
to make sure the game didn't end right there and then.
Yeah. Um, I think the important thing there is that you live to see that next untap step. You get to regain all of those resources because that untap step in a 4 player format, you get one of those for every 3 untaps that you see your opponents have because there's
Hmm.
3 opponents per you. Um, that's really where mana becomes so important in our format because it's not your mana versus one other players where everything is equal. It's your mana versus 3 other players. And you're not winning that under normal circumstances. Your one land drop does not outweigh the other 3. So things like Mana Crypt, Soul Ring, Mana Vault, developing your mana so that you can compete against multiple players worth of mana is why you see decks like Blue Farm and this Grixis Shell and Rogsai, decks that are able to consistently put out mana and get ahead of the curve and up on tempo and effectively use mana is why those decks are the tier one of the format.
Hmm. It's the mixture between being able to tempo your opponents consistently, but also be able to keep your resources high to match that consistent tempo
Mhm.
plays. Like a really good example that I actually saw the other night when I was playing was there was one of my friend's Grixis decks. He has the counterbalance, but he has it with Crom. So this is an example of a tempo play I think is really good in Commander. Not saying counterbalance is really good in Commander, like, but what I'm saying is that this is a good example of a tempo play like stacks because you're using one card, which is your counterbalance, and then the card draw from your Crom to continuously tempo your opponents, and then
Yep.
all these other things, like over and over again. So you're getting a lot of worth from one card, which is not very common in Commander to get a lot of consistent worth from one card that also stops your
Yeah.
opponents.
I think this is a really good talking point here. Counterbalance specifically is such an interesting card in the
Hmm.
format in what it does to play patterns. So, on its surface, if I see an opponent with a counterbalance in play, I'm pretty hesitant of what I'm going to cast. And a savvy opponent is also going to be cautious on whether or not they choose to utilize that counterbalance and actually reveal the card on top. So, if I cast, let's say, a Ponder, it's pretty likely that my opponent could have a one drop on top of their deck. I would say it's the second most common mana value next to zero. They could very easily flip a card and blind counter my Ponder. Is that worth revealing that information and giving that info to the rest of my opponents saying, don't cast one drops, they will get countered. You use your mana some other way. That information lets my opponents now use the information. They're able to effectively use their mana. They're not getting tempoed out by this card anymore. They might have to make some suboptimal plays, some weird sequencing, but they're still able to effectively navigate that around this counterbalance. Now, the very savvy opponent that says, no, your ponder resolves, I won't reveal, there's still this bit of like a cat and mouse game of like, what can or can I not get away with? How much do I want to commit into this? Am I just going to say, you know what? I'm going to let someone else figure this out. I'm just going to pass here. Am I going to let my mana rot now? Am I going to waste that tempo, my untap step that is so valuable in this game? If the game is only going 4 turns, I get 4 untap steps and I'm blowing one because I don't want to get absolutely blown out by this counterbalance and letting it rotate through.
What I think is a really
That's
cool,
that's a huge source of tempo from counterbalance.
right, right. And what I think is really cool about this whole idea of that counterbalance brings in is that it really makes you see the weights of all the resources. Like it's not just mana versus card advantage or anything. It's information,
Information is so huge.
it's turn order, it's all this like all this resource. Like it's just
Mhm.
everything a part of Magic is a resource, and the way that it all interacts with each other is always different, and it's never like a linear thing.
Yep. That's also why combining counterbalance with some ability to constantly change the top card of your deck and
Hmm.
keeping that information as a limited resource to the rest of your opponents. So Crom's a perfect example. Crom is constantly drawing cards,
Hmm.
constantly changing the top card of your deck. Ristic, Mystic, Sensei's top, Thrasios activations. Any way that you have to manipulate the top card of your deck and keep your opponents off of knowing what is going to be flipped to this counterbalance and keeping them guessing, keeping them from effectively using their mana and sequencing their spells correctly is gaining you tempo. That is when your counterbalance crosses from just like a strict card advantage tool to an actual tempo piece. You are gaining mana on your opponents. You are driving ahead in the game.
Yeah, definitely. And in that way, you are, especially when you combine it with changing the top card in
Mhm.
some way, you are making it a resource in the way that you are taking the resource away, the knowledge that of your top card away from your opponents, which is arguably tempo in this
Mhm.
case.
And also to further springboard off this idea of mana and effective mana, you don't actually have to spend mana or like spend less mana than your opponents to gain tempo. A perfect example of this is another top tier deck, Winota. As we had said
Mm,
before, you have like your Grixis core shells of your Rogsite and your Bluefar. Winota's not that. Winota looks nothing like those decks. How is Winota, the Stacks deck, like a fantastic tier one tempo deck? It's because Winota cheats so much mana. When you attack with these stupid things like a Ginger Brew or your Ornithopter when you have a Winota in
yeah.
play, you're gaining 2, 3, sometimes 7 mana worth of card of effective mana onto the board and contributing to your board state on these turns with your combat.
Yeah, so
You're
you
not actually gaining mana in the sense of like your opponent's wasting their mana. You're just gaining effective mana and free spells. It's absurd. It is a source of card advantage, but most importantly, it's mana advantage. You're not having to cast these spells. Casting spells for free is absurd.
this isn't even casting spells, it's another step, it just puts it right out there. But with Winota,
Oh yeah, you
it's
wanted to do something here? No, Grand
no, Grand
Abolisher. You
Abolisher's
can
out
no,
now.
just get out of here with that.
Yeah, Winota is so powerful because it mixes card advantage and mana production into one uncounterable effect. And I think that's why
yeah, it,
Winota is just so stupid. I hate Winota.
Yeah, well, I see posts of like I love like the idea of stacks. What stacks do I should play? Like I know Blood Pod was a thing at one point, or there's like
It's nowhere
this
as good as
Urza
Winota.
control with like some stacks pieces. Like no,
Just
just
play
play Winota.
Winota.
Winota's
You
the
wanna
best
play a
stacks
good
deck,
stack deck,
head
just
and
play
shoulders
Winota.
above everything else. It is absurd what that thing can do.
100%. And I almost wish there was more of an argument for a different stack deck, but there's not because if we're talking about tempo and what the best tempo play stack deck is,
Mhm.
it's just Winota every single time.
Yep. Stacks is about changing the way the dynamics of the game and how mana and cards effectively translate. And it does a great job of putting stacks pieces into play and negating your opponent's effectiveness and use of mana. And it also just cheats on mana so unbelievably well. It is fighting on like both directions on this singular axis, and it does it so incredibly well in such a tight package.
So talking about how Winota kind of does both the mana production and card advantage, um,
Mhm.
what is the argument you think between mana production versus card advantage, and which one is better, and at what point in the game would one be more favorable over the other?
Yeah, obviously you need to have both. One of the examples I like to point to is like I commonly play with Greg, our other co-host.
Hmm.
He loves to play Curious Control. Curious Control loves to draw cards. He plays a turn one Mystic Remorter. I don't care. I don't have the counter spell. It sticks. I'm feeding that thing. I am casting all of my spells. I have complete disregard for it because I know that he does not have the mana on turn one to effectively convert all of that card advantage that he just got into actual advantage in the game. Another
Hmm.
perfect example is another legacy favorite, Standstill. Standstill is a one and a blue enchantment, sits in play. Whenever a player casts a spell, it puts a triggered ability on the stack to sacrifice Standstill, and the other players draw 3 cards. So there's 2 ways that you can get around standstill, or there's 2 play patterns that evolve around this. The first one is you kind of just wait and you bide your time, you develop your mana, and then you finally just say, you know what, I can't wait anymore. You crack the standstill, you give your opponents your 3 cards, and you try and fight through it. The other way to do it is you just say, don't care, bulldoze through it right then, right there. Give you your 3 cards. You're at 10 cards in hand on your end step. Discard to hand size. I'm going to my turn. I'm going to use my mana.
Hmm.
That's the more tempo effective way that I see the format evolving. If you are trying to slow your own development by paying for these turn one mystics and mystics instead of like, I'm not going to play my mana crypt out because it's going to give my opponent a card on turn one. You've lost. Like you can't do that. Your turn and that tempo is so valuable. You have to sort of sacrifice your opponent giving them all of that card advantage for the sake of your mana development. There's this constant tension between the two. And I think the way that it boils down, or like the term that I would boil it down to, is just effective mana. You have to use your mana efficiently every turn, whether it's spent on cards or denying your opponent's cards, preventing your opponents from winning the game to see that next untap step to get that extra bout of mana. You have to use it efficiently.
Yeah, I want to talk about that real quick because it's definitely a learning curve that not just myself, but other people in our group have kind of gone through. It's if you have the opportunity to kind of go for something now, but it's going to feed your opponents a little bit of resources, or you could pay for those resources and go for it next turn. You need to just be going for it now because the reality is the chance that you actually get another turn after paying for these resources and tempoing yourself is so low. It's like it's such a feels bad moment too to say, well, I could like pay 5 mana for this spell and it'll pay for Ristics and whatever, and the next turn I'll have more mana to be able to do what I want to do while also denying resources. It's like there is no next turn. Sorry, breach is on the stack already. You don't have time for this. Um, so the,
And I don't want to say that there's never a time and place to pay or like to not pay
right,
for it.
right.
Like
That's not what I'm
there are
saying.
obviously times when like you can afford to pay it, and that's usually because your mana is so far developed that you can afford to pay the extra mana on these spells. You can
Hmm.
take that tempo hit to deny that card advantage. It's never a black or white, a yes or no question. Like they are like two axes that you have to balance between. If you skew one way and completely sacrifice the other, you're going to lose. You
100%.
can't draw 20 cards in a game and have zero mana and can't convert those cards into actual advantage. You can't on an empty hand play a dockside, make 30 mana and then do nothing with it because you don't have an outlet for that mana. You need to not only develop the mana and use the mana, and draw the cards and use the cards. It all needs to come together.
It's all one big puzzle, and like you said, there is no like right or wrong. It's just trying to realize when it's right to tempo yourself and when it is wrong to tempo yourself,
Mm-hmm.
which is so
Yeah.
different, like I said, in Commander than it is like Legacy.
Yes. The context of balancing not just your position against one player, but your position against three is huge. Um, I know I'm gonna love to bring this up. We were playing a game probably a week or two ago, and Connor is on a Timna based deck, and Connor's like, Zach, can I attack you with this? And I said, you know what? Yes. Yes, you can.
So
I'm
so
gonna give you
stupid.
a card. I gave Connor a card for free. And you know why? Because I am in fourth. I am clearly dead last this game. I have no hope right now. Connor's in third, not much farther ahead than me. Evan and Jack miles ahead of the table. Jack has a Ristic study. Evan's Evan's so done with this. He's going to pick up the
I hate
dog.
this game.
Evan's got like a Grazilax or what is the snake in your Animar list that draws
Oh,
cards?
Frostfang.
Yeah, like they're drawing a million cards. They have all of their mana developed. The way that I justified this decision in getting back in the game is by if I boost Connor in this game a little bit and make him more of a threat, the other two have to spend resources on Connor. And the net resources used by my opponent, they're using cards, they're using mana to all compete with each other. And that effectively brings me back into the game. It doesn't pull me ahead, it brings them down slightly. That's kind of like you've probably seen it in how like rogue decks at like more, I wouldn't say casual tables, but like you're playing CDH against some wacky like Scarab God deck,
Hmm.
and you're like, what the hell is this thing doing? It has no right to win. Maybe it's Kyle on Tatiova, and you're like, how is this thing winning?
So
And it's because like three other people tried to win before him. They all blew all of their interaction and resources, and there's nothing left to deal with this. Like
what?
your opponents interacting with each other and you sitting there and not getting involved and just developing your mana, developing your card advantage is effectively gaining tempo.
Yeah, what you didn't say from this story is the actual payoff that you were actually looking for. What happened was, a threat came down that I had to deal with in order so
Yep.
Connor didn't get enough
I think it was a
advantage.
Mayhem
It was a
Devil, and you're
Mayhem
like, I
Devil,
have a bunch of
and
one
I'm
ones. This
on.
Mayhem Devil's gonna ruin me.
It's a Mayhem Devil. I'm on a Dockside plan. I have a bunch of 1/1s. I need to use resources to stop this. So I used a Force of Will and activation of Survival Fizz to get a blue creature. So what Zach did here is he basically paid 2 life to get 1 card out of Connor's hand, 2 cards out of my hand, and an extra mana out of me because I had to activate a tutor. in order to
And
defeat
3
boss.
mana out of Connor, who's also tight on
And
mana at
3
this
mana
point.
cannon
Like,
counter. So you
it's
got
perfect. I
everything
will
you
happily
wanted.
spend 2 life for that any day of the week.
Right, you
Your
got
life is just another perfect example of a
yeah.
resource that you have to use for tempo.
So you used your
Like,
resources so well here,
yes.
and it's not just like your life resource, it was also your ability to politic and know what was happening in the game to be able to make this type of play. And this is one of the cool things I think that Commander brings is that there's no way you're able to make this type of play in 1v1, right? Because giving your opponents any
No,
resources
when you
is
have like
different.
one-on-one direct opposition, there's no politicking, there's no social aspect, there's no like you can't gang up on other players like that whole aspect that makes CEDH such a unique competitive format is completely lost in 1v1 Magic.
Hmm.
And it's a pretty jarring experience. I've listened to a lot of like 60 card players that I've looked up to for a while come into CEDH, and that is one of the first things that they mention. There's like they know how to navigate ad nauseum lines. They can navigate super weird, tight underworld breach lines. That's not where they struggle. They thrive in that environment. The weird thing is the social dynamic that CEDH brings and how that also plays into tempo and gaining and giving your opponents resources to balance out the game and try and effectively bring yourself back in on this perspective is so unique. And I think it's something that is quite often overlooked.
I think it is too because I don't know. I just really like the balance of how everything is a resource down to even using your opponents as a resource that you just kind of don't get anywhere else. And I think it's more prevalent in maybe it's more prevalent in casual commander even because you're making deals and type of things. But in CDH, it's manipulating the board state to be what you want it to be, which is just another player skill that comes up.
Greg is so good at this too. I absolutely hate it. I am too like heads up and honest to a fault sometimes in games that I play with Greg. And Greg very easily like manipulates the table as the control player, gets them to spend resources so it's not just him. He's gaining that tempo back that way. Greg has convinced people to counter their own spells. That is a
Okay,
true
I'd like to
fact.
point out that
I
it's not
I
our group that has this has happened to,
no.
but
None of us have
yes.
countered our own spells under Greg's like witchcraft, but it has happened. We have bet in games where we watch Greg silver tongue his way into people countering their own spells. It's absurd.
Oh, it's definitely dumb, but I mean, as a control player who is trying to effectively tempo the table, he is just
Mhm,
using all of his resources to successfully tempo his opponents.
mhm. Yeah, it's not even necessarily like you have to be a tempo deck and only tempo decks care about tempo. It is like there you can look at individual plays in the context or the lens of like, is this tempo positive? Is this card advantage positive? Like, what am I gaining in these two like sort of competing fields? Sometimes you can gain both in cards like counterbalance.
Hmm.
Sometimes you can only gain one or the other, and it's very important to balance the two and not slide too heavily in one direction, or you're just going to fall apart where you have all mana and nowhere to go, or all cards and nothing to do, or
Yeah,
no
I'm
way to
sure we've
cast them.
all had that moment where you get like wheeled and you get wheeled into nothing but mana with no
Yeah, you
payoff.
draw
So
4 lands, Mana Crypt, Dark Ritual, and you're like, where's my ad nos?
right, and you don't have the payoff. Or on the other hand, you have like all of these payoff cards and no mana to get there. So there's a balance between the two that you want, but it is really important to not lean too heavily into one side.
Oh, yeah, my favorite thing is when people are mulliganing and they're like, they draw their 7 cards and they're like, man, this hand's just all, it's so good. If it only had mana, or if only it had land. I'm like, yeah, of course it is, because it's just all gas. You have all cards and no actual mana production. That's like the critical piece that you look for in hands to mulligan.
My favorite hands that opponents keep are like five 3 mana spells or 2 mana spells or whatever, one land and a Mystic Remora. So they're
Oh,
gonna
they're
one
going
land
nowhere.
Mystic
They're
Remora
going
and they're
nowhere.
going nowhere because they get the Mystic Remora for one turn before they do something else, or they just
I'm
pay
a
for it and do
huge
nothing.
proponent actually of saving the Mystic Remora and casting it on turn 2 and being
Hmm.
able to actually like not just use all of your mana every turn to just develop your or like keep around this Mystic Remora, but if you go like land dork turn 2, you play that Mystic Remora, that's staying around so much longer. It's gaining so much card advantage then, and you're still using your mana to do other things and to develop the rest of your board and actually convert that card advantage you're getting
Yeah.
into effectively winning the game.
Yeah, totally. There is um, definitely a distinction there between what you want to be doing as far as mana production versus card advantage.
Definitely. All right. I think we have hit all of
Yeah.
our topics here.
Did we get a community question from someone?
I don't think we did.
Let's see. I think my question to you then will be, what is your favorite deck to play as far as tempoing other opponents? You personally, because I know Greg's would be like
Me
Curious Control, but
personally.
like, what is your personal favorite
Greg
tempo
only
deck?
plays Curious Control.
Well,
That's
we know
why.
that.
So my favorite deck to play, I've been playing a lot of Ashaya and a lot of Magda currently. I think I really love monocolored decks. I think they have a unique deck building constraint to them being monocolored,
Hmm.
and you get to play a lot of cards that you normally wouldn't. They're usually very commander focused because the whole point of playing monocolored, if you try and build towards something that's like, oh, I'm just a Simic deck, but I'm trying to play in the style of like this teamer deck. The teamer deck just has a wider card pool. They're gonna get better cards. They get Dockside, they get Breach. If I'm trying to do what they're doing, I'm just going to be strictly worse because I don't have access to the same card quality. I'm going to have to lean into my commander more and more unique card effects. And I think that is a super cool thing about monocolored decks. So my decks of choice are usually Ashaya and Magda, which are generally stacks focused, but they also have this like turbo aspect of it where like I can cast Ashaya on turn one and threaten to win on turns two or three. I can ramp out a Magda and two other dwarves and make a bunch of treasures and threaten to win the game very quickly. But I can also just go like turn one Null Rod, turn one Sphere of Resistance, turn one Trinisphere. And that fluctuation between playstyles and how the table has to respect what I'm doing to an extent, and they can't just mulligans like, well, this hand's good, but if Zach plays a turn one Sphere of Resistance, this hand is garbage and I'm going nowhere. Like, I love that part of Magic, and I feel like that is because of like the tempo that that deck threatens or those decks threaten to have.
Yeah, that's definitely a very accurate take that you have there because I have kept hands because of the deck you're playing or shift hands away because of what you're playing, and it's all very random, but also very how do I say it, like consistent in the way that
Mhm.
certain decks are going to try to deal with you, and you have to be ready to deal with them. So that's a good
Yeah,
take.
there's definitely this level one thought process of I know what my general strategy is. I have a plan. I look at the cards in my hand. I know how I want to sequence them. The level two strategy is, I think, one of the biggest barriers in improving as a player. And that's what do my opponents want to do? What are they trying to do? What can they have? How do I not only navigate my own plan and progress my board state, but also how do I make it awkward for them? How do I time my spells so they have to use interaction at inopportune times? How do I make them use mana less effectively without sacrificing my own plan? And I think that is a huge level up moment for a lot of Magic players.
Yeah, I agree with that because it has happened to me. Um, yeah. Do you have any other closing thoughts?
I think that wraps us up here.
Yeah.
It's been a good talk. I hopefully we do not add to like this echo chamber of just like people talking at each other about what they think tempo is. Hopefully I have like synthesized some ideas of what a lot of prominent figures have and explained and given people a more tangible definition of what tempo is and how they can apply it to their games.
Yeah, if it means anything to anyone else, Zach is definitely the guy I would ask about any of this other stuff because he comes from 1v1 formats way before I even started playing Magic. So, I don't know. I trust him. You should too.
That's just a nice way of saying I'm old.
Yeah, maybe. But yeah.
As the non-college student in the group.
Yeah, we've been the Pass Priority podcast, and I pass priority.
Thank you.